Throughout the breadth of human history, there has always been one goal that stood out above the rest: conquering. Since the beginning of our time on this planet, humans have spread, multiplied, and killed their way to becoming masters of their own environment. In the 100,000 years of our existence, we have destroyed biomes, terraformed landscapes, and brought species to their extinction. That goal has never changed since our first steps out of the caves. I think we tend to think of ourselves as more civilized in the modern age, being aware of our environment and taking active steps to fix our ancient misgivings. It feels like our wholesale butchery is long behind us. Environmentalists in the 1970s knew how naive that sentiment was. An organization dubbed Greenpeace was on a crusade against the horrific practices of whaling. Whaling is the hunting down of whales for their blubber to use for oil, baleen for fabric, and sometimes the meat itself. Whaling as a practice by the 20th century had fallen out of fashion. Most countries acknowledged that we had much safer alternatives to the resources collected from whales, and due to environmental and ethical concerns, it became an antiquated technique left to the annals of history. Greenpeace had been specifically targeting whaling countries to bring awareness to their cause. One country that practiced whaling but without any of the regards of the restraints given to the other modern states was the Soviet Union. In 1975, Greenpeace tracked down the Russian whaling ship the Dalny Vostok. The activists hunkered down in their minuscule raft right next to a massive steel behemoth on the hunt for pods of whales. With the shot perfectly composed, the activists snapped a picture, and it screamed a loud message. The ragtag band of activists on the side of saving this small amount of great whales versus the personification of industry, the massive ships spewing toxins in the air and bleeding the oceans dry. This image would come to be the most successful spark of awareness of illegal whaling in the 20th century, something most people either had no idea was going on or really didn't care about. This one image changed the narrative and began the unraveling of what author Charles Homans calls the most senseless environmental crime of the 20th century. Let's take a look behind the curtain into the Soviets' highly illegal, long secretive, whaling experiment. The Soviet Union entered into the realm of whaling much later than other countries. It was ordered directly by the General Secretary of the Communist Party and unequivocal leader of the Soviet Union, Joseph Stalin. Whaling was only a facet of the much larger Soviet five-year plan, a plan to rapidly industrialize and gain equal footing or surpass other technologically advanced countries. Whaling was a way to get oil cheap, and to the Soviets, these whales were an endless source of cheap oil. Whaling was just one of the many ways to flash cook the Soviet economy. Fish in mass quantities, destroy forests to meet lumber quotas, hunt until there weren't any hands to bring the meat home. The Soviet mission statement was quantity over quality. Didn't matter how the quotas were met, just as long as they were fulfilled or over-fulfilled. Stalin was notoriously known as Chelovik iz Stali, or the Man of Steel, and dealt with any ministers that failed to meet their quota. Russian whaling began in 1932 with the recent requisition of an American cargo vessel that was Frankensteined into a whaling vessel in 1931. The ship was named the Aleut, and it undertook its maiden voyage bound for Vladivostok. The Aleut missed over half of the first whaling season and decided to just test the new vessel out off the coast of the Revillagigedo Islands. This first test netted the crew 21 whales, and it wasn't until 1933 that the beginning of the Soviets' destruction would begin. Between the years of 1933 and the early 1940s, the Soviets skimmed the high seas for any prize they could bring back. In 1936, captain of the Aleut, A. Dudnik, was awarded the Order of Lenin, one of the highest medals of honor in the USSR, for his bravery and competence as captain. Their efforts were environmentally destructive, but according to the state, it wasn't enough. The Aleut barely managed to kill around 1,000 whales yearly, much to the chagrin of Stalin. In 1937, Captain Dudnik was arrested by the secret police on charges of being a Japanese agent and attempting to sell the whaling fleet to the Empire of Japan. These charges are completely unfounded. There is not a shred of proof available that Captain Dudnik conspired against the state, but such was life in the Soviet Union. One year you're awarded, the next you're being charged for crimes you may have never even heard of, only because quota wasn't being met. After the forced retirement of the Aleut's captain, Soviet whaling began to fizzle out. His firing was of course not the cause of cessation, something much bigger was taking attention away from the whaling efforts. In 1941, the former strained alliance between Adolf Hitler of Nazi Germany and Joseph Stalin snapped under the pressure of over 3 million German boots. Soviet Russia had been invaded, and any thoughts of whaling sunk beneath the waves. World War II was the most devastating war in human history. Millions of lives were lost, but the Germans were beaten back between a combined Allied force. In 1945, the Soviet Red Army planted their flag at the top of the Reichstag, the German parliament building where the atrocities of Nazi Germany were strategized. This victory placed Russia as a main player on the world stage. By 1946, life in the Soviet Union started to repair. As things began to return to normal, the whaling industry began to bloom once again. The same year their whaling endeavor began to expand, an international committee met in Washington to sign the newly formed International Convention for the Regulation of Whaling. This treaty set strict guidelines on whaling. It limited the number of catches allowed, outlawed whaling certain species and sizes of species. It also created the International Whaling Committee, or IWC. In late 1946, the Soviets acquired the 500-foot ship, the old German warship, the Vikinger. The ship was outfitted with a new crew, new machines, and new weapons. It said that the ship could strip one whale of its natural resources every 30 minutes. Lined with harpoons and renamed the Slava, the ship was ready to set sail along with its entourage of smaller catcher boats. The fleet was destined for the coasts of Antarctica, the furthest Soviet whaling had ever ventured. At around the same time as the Slava's maiden voyage, the Soviets also gained control of Japanese whaling stations on the Kuril Islands, beginning another whaling front in 1948. The Slava's first season was considered a failure, only catching around 400 whales. As the seasons went on, the Slava became more and more skilled at finding, catching, and harvesting the whales. By the early 1950s, the Slava was averaging 2,000 whales a season. By the mid to late 1950s, they bumped that number by 1,000, averaging 3,000 whales in total. By 1957, the Soviet whalers found themselves a mass party of whales off the coast of New Zealand and Australia. 1959 would be a major year for the Soviet whaling efforts as a new fleet was commissioned and spearheaded by the Sovietskaya Ukraina. The whalers became so effective at their jobs that they were killing these whales before the factory ships were able to process the materials. Most of the time, the whale was slaughtered and heaved back into the ocean where the meat became unusable, and at that rate, they didn't even go in for the bones or the baleen. They would skin the whale for the blubber and leave the rest of the rotting carcass to bob endlessly atop the crashing waves. The Soviets ramped up their production with a breakneck speed, adding the ship the Yuri Dolgoruki in 1960 and the Sovietskaya Rossiya in 1961. After the Sovietskaya Rossiya joined the rest, it marked a pivotal moment for the Soviet whaling efforts. They had amassed the largest whaling fleet in the entire world. From 1957 until 1963, the Soviet whaling fleets mindlessly slaughtered around 40,000 whales. Their murders were so horrific, it led to the Australia and New Zealand whaling station to be closed due to a lack of whales. The 1960s were extremely profitable for the whalers. Between the years of 1962 and the early 70s, entire pods of humpback whales were decimated, along with massive numbers of blue whales. The whalers on their way home from the Antarctic had a nasty habit of whaling in tropical waters, which for them was completely illegal. Entire populations of Arabian humpbacks and pygmy blue whales were completely destroyed. Only a few years after the addition of 2 new vessels in the Antarctic, the Soviets pushed forward into a new domain for whaling. In 1963, the North Pacific Ocean was the newest target. The Soviets added 2 new ships, the Dolny Vostok and the Vladivostok. The North Pacific Ocean campaign was just as intense and quota-minded as the Antarctic front. The bloodshed continued to mount. The Aleut was moved to the North Pacific and, despite its age, slaughtered 1,200 humpback whales. The 2 larger fleets in the North Pacific targeted the recovering pods of humpbacks and caught around 2,800 of them. The most devastating crime of all perpetrated by the Soviets in the North Pacific was their systematic killings of the right whales. The species was under protection from commercial whaling and were only available for scientific inquiries with a permit. The Soviets took advantage of this tiny population and killed en masse. Only 11 whales were reported, yet years later, Records show that they caught and killed around 4,000 of the protected species. 1967 saw the retirement of the ship that began all of this horror, the Aleut, marking the end of an era. This was still far from the final nail in the coffin for the USSR's crusade for their arbitrary whale quotas. By the early 70s, the North Pacific whalers had almost run out of male sperm whales to hunt. This turned their attention to the females. Hunting for female whales was not illegal, however, they were a lot more restricted than males. Females that were pregnant, lactating, or caring for calves were completely off limits. The USSR paid no mind to these restrictions and went on another killing spree due to the lack of males, since they had nearly erased the entire population of them. The Soviets' carnage went straight through the early 1970s with no intention of slowing. In 1975, the activist Greenpeace initiated Project Ahab. This was going to be the way to wake the world up and show everyone the kind of destruction the Soviet Union had on the environment. The team geared up and spotted the Dolny Vostok in action. That's when they snapped their iconic image that sparked the fire in the hearts and minds of everyone that saw it. This image saw the beginning of the end for the Soviets, as throughout the mid to late 70s, the Soviet whaling project began to destabilize. Project Ahab was so successful that by 1980, the Soviets were pressured to disband Vladivostok and the Dolny Vostok. In 1982, the Soviets protested at the banning of commercial whaling. However, the damage had already been done. Following the final seasons in the Arctic in 1986 and 87, the Soviets declared their whaling efforts would be completely disbanded. So what happened here? How was the Soviet Union able to get away with such destruction? What was the purpose of this? If they didn't even use the whale, then what was the point? How did we learn the full truth of their deception after years of secrecy? The regulations set by the IWC were just rules, with essentially nobody to enforce them for the first 15 years or so. Only beginning in 1960 is when the IWC enlisted the help of fishery experts to oversee and track the quotas of every whaling nation. Scientists were dispatched to each whaling nation to cross-reference the limit of catches and the catches being reported. In classic Soviet Union fashion, these reported catches were complete farces. Nearly every species that the Soviets had killed was over double the legal amount, and this simple act of misreporting allowed the USSR fleets to get away with their heinous crimes for decades. It's not like the experts weren't privy to something going on with Soviet whaling. The observers knew that the Soviets had twice the amount of ships and were stretching their fleets way farther than any other country. For years, the world was left in the dark to the true nature of the USSR's crimes. Things hit a turning point in 1993, only 2 years after the Soviet Union dissolved completely. Alexei Yablokov was a highly respected Soviet whale researcher. Yablokov was in contact with Robert Brownell, an American scientist, and their contact lasted throughout the decades of Soviet whaling. Everything changed when Brownell's colleague was researching right whale fetuses. The numbers seemed off, so Brownell reached out to Yablokov, who was now the science advisor to Russian President Boris Yeltsin. Yablokov reported that the Russians had around 150 documented right whale fetuses, which didn't seem right. That meant that the Russians had lied about their catches the entire time. Brownell urged Yablokov to make a public statement regarding the truth of the Soviet whaling efforts. In Galveston, Texas, Yablokov went public to a marine mammals conference. The public finally became aware of the crimes committed, but this was only the beginning. Brownell and Yablokov began stitching together the true scope of what really happened out in the freezing waters. The two men worked from two major sources, the first being Dmitry Tormozov. Tormozov worked aboard the Yuri Dolgoruki, and instead of burning the catch records, he urged his comrades to save them. This was an extremely brave move since the burning of documents was required by the Fisheries Ministry. Tormozov had the real documentation of around 15 seasons of whaling, which was integral to our understanding of the full story. The other source came from scientist Alfred Berzin, who was stationed on the Sovetskaya Rossiya. Berzin served on countless fleets, and his source was first-hand. He had given the reason as to why the whales were killed for little more than just the crew claiming they had killed them. One of his most harrowing first-hand accounts comes from this quote. "I can recall seeing the bow of a catcher moving through warm, blue tropical waters and a harpooner behind the gun, dressed only in bathing trunks and with a red bandana on his head, chasing obviously a female with a calf. What dignity this was." The hard numbers from Tormazov were essential, but Berzin gave a more human view of what witnessing this destruction was really like. Berzin also explained the Soviet bureaucracy's hand in the entire operation and emphasized yet again how quota was more important than the resources themselves. Between the two men, we finally understood everything there was to know about Russian whaling, and their testimonies serve as a warning to future generations. From 1932 up until 1987, the Soviet Union formed a deep cut through our oceans that we are still healing to this day. In the Antarctic, the Soviets claimed they caught 185,776 whales. However, the true estimate was more around 338,336. In the North Pacific, the same lie permeated. They claimed to have caught 169,615. However, the true number was around 194,177. It was the most devastating environmental crime of the 20th century, and the wound is not even close to being patched, even 3 decades of whale protection later. Something that I find hard to wrap my head around is how the Soviet Union was able to convince these men to participate in such a harrowing environmental disaster. This can be traced back directly to the Soviet propaganda machine. These sailors were seen as highly respected and high earners. These men were able to see the world on massive ships and enlist in some kind of adventure. Sailors brought home goods from different parts of the world that you would never dream of in Soviet Russia, and they started trading them on the black market. The work was glamorized. Sailors returning home gathered massive parades of red Soviet flags, cheering crowds, and plenty of alcohol. It was a dream job for these men. To sail the world, serve their country, show their families how dedicated they were. It was a win-win for the country and the men that were being taken advantage of. They were soldiers, they were following orders, mindlessly killing for king and country, and they were blind to the scope of their true destruction. Ryan Tucker Jones, author of Red Leviathan, The Secret History of Soviet Whaling, was able to detail encounters with some of these ex-whalers in an article from Slate.com. The first pair of sailors recounted their tales with nostalgia, claiming the sea and prosperity called them to their profession. The second recounted tales of horror, feeling crushing guilt for the crimes they had committed. Jones wrote in his article, "I sensed here the troubled heart of my book. I liked these people who had perpetrated one of the greatest ecological catastrophes the world's oceans have ever seen. I felt a respect for the fact that whaling had given their lives solid, positive meaning. I shared their fascination with whales. But what I perceived as genocide, they thought of simply as work, and I was amazed at how little their recollections included danger or drama." It's been 30 years since the USSR's crimes have been enlightened from the shadows. In Berzin's memoir, he wrote that only 30% of the whales were actually used for what they were hunting them for. The rest, like we saw, were tossed, rotting atop the waves. The IWC's pause on commercial whaling has been a blessing for our world, with many species slowly recovering from not only Soviet whaling, but multiple nations that engaged in the practice. You did hear me right. The IWC only paused commercial whaling, and in 2010, around 7 countries attempted to repeal the pause so they could restart their whaling projects. Currently, whaling is still outlawed across the world, with some exceptions depending on a country's status with the IWC. It's a scary thought that someday a bunch of high-profile nations could end the protections for these gentle giants. What we can do is stay educated. If this subject is important to you, you aren't powerless. Know your resources and join causes that you believe in. Together we can make a difference to make sure something as heinous as Soviet whaling never happens again. Humans were born to conquer, but we were also born to nurture, to protect. Our brain is our most powerful weapon, and if we use it to stay environmentally conscious, we can make a change for the better.
Милый мальчик мой, ты лишь пухла с носом длинным, и потому не мой.